The rain pelted against the windows of the city hospital, a relentless drumbeat that echoed the hurried footsteps and soft murmurs of the bustling emergency room. Nurses moved briskly from one patient to the next, their faces a picture of calm efficiency. Doctors discussed cases in hushed tones, their words blending with the hum of machinery and distant beeps of monitors. In the middle of this controlled chaos, Dr. Adrian Carter, a seasoned physician known for his unwavering focus, sat at his desk reviewing patient charts. The overhead light cast a warm glow on his desk, but his sharp blue eyes were fixed on the papers in front of him. He was the type of doctor who rarely let emotions cloud his judgment, yet there was a humanity in his work that patients and colleagues alike admired. His calm demeanor was like an anchor in the storm of emergencies he faced daily. The sound of hurried footsteps broke his concentration. A young nurse appeared in the doorway, her face pale and her eyes wide with urgency. "Dr. Carter," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "you need to come to room 204. It's the girl." Dr. Carter's brows knit together. "The girl? What happened?" he asked, already rising from his chair. "She just woke up," the nurse said, her words tumbling out in a rush. "But there's something off. She's asking for you specifically." Without another word, Dr. Carter grabbed his stethoscope and followed the nurse down the hallway. The fluorescent lights above flickered slightly, casting long shadows on the white walls. The atmosphere seemed heavier with every step they took, as though the air itself carried the weight of something unspeakable. Room 204 was at the end of the hall, its door slightly ajar. Inside, the room was dimly lit, the only source of illumination coming from the muted glow of the monitoring equipment. Lying on the bed was a frail girl, no older than 10, her pale face framed by unkempt auburn hair. Her eyes, large and glassy, stared at the ceiling as though searching for answers in the cracks of the plaster. Dr. Carter approached her cautiously. "Hello there," he said gently, pulling up a chair beside her bed. "I'm Dr. Carter. The nurses told me you wanted to see me." The girl turned her head slowly, her gaze locking onto his. Her lips trembled as she tried to speak, but the words seemed caught in her throat. The doctor noticed the dark circles under her eyes, the kind that hinted at sleepless nights and untold pain. "It's okay," he reassured her. "Take your time, you're safe here." The girl swallowed hard, her small hands clutching the blanket tightly. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper, so faint that Dr. Carter had to lean in to catch her words. "They're coming," she said, her tone chillingly devoid of emotion. Dr. Carter blinked, momentarily taken aback. "Who's coming?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. The girl hesitated, her lips trembling again. Then, with a sudden burst of strength, she gripped his hand. Her small fingers felt icy against his skin. She leaned closer, her voice dropping to a whisper so quiet it was almost lost beneath the steady beeping of the heart monitor. "They're here," she murmured. A shiver ran down Dr. Carter's spine. Before he could press her for more, the monitors began to beep erratically. The girl's heart rate spiked, and her breathing became shallow. The nurse rushed to the bedside, her hands moving quickly to adjust the oxygen mask. "Doctor, her vitals are unstable," the nurse exclaimed. Dr. Carter acted swiftly, issuing orders to stabilize her. Yet even as he worked, his mind replayed her words. "They're here." The phrase hung in the air like a dark cloud, refusing to dissipate. As the medical team worked around him, a sudden, eerie sound echoed through the hospital, an alarm blaring loudly, signaling a lockdown. The staff froze, their eyes darting toward the intercom system. "This is a code red," a robotic voice announced. "All personnel remain in your designated areas. Do not attempt to exit the building." Dr. Carter's heart raced. Lockdowns were rare and usually reserved for extreme situations, security breaches, biohazard leaks, or worse. But what could possibly warrant such a drastic measure tonight? He looked back at the girl, her face now calm as though she had said all she needed to. Her eyes fluttered shut, and she drifted into unconsciousness, leaving behind more questions than answers. Dr. Carter stood there, torn between tending to his patient and understanding the chaos unraveling around him. Something about her words gnawed at him, a primal instinct urging him to connect the dots. And then, just as he thought the situation couldn't grow more bizarre, the power flickered. The hospital lights dimmed, casting the room into a shadowy haze before they surged back to life. Outside the room, muffled voices and hurried footsteps signaled growing panic. Dr. Carter turned to the nurse. "Stay with her. Don't let her out of your sight," he instructed, his voice steady but urgent. The nurse nodded, her face pale with fear. As Dr. Carter stepped into the hallway, the tension was palpable. Staff members whispered anxiously, and patients peered out from their rooms, their faces etched with worry. What had the girl meant? What was coming? And why had the hospital suddenly gone into lockdown? The questions circled in Dr. Carter's mind as he made his way toward the central command room. He didn't know it yet, but the events of this night would challenge everything he thought he knew about the world and about himself. Dr. Carter's footsteps echoed softly down the long, sterile corridor as he moved toward the command center. The hospital seemed unnaturally quiet despite the murmur of voices and the shuffle of staff. There was something unsettling about the silence that settled in between the faint beeps of machines and hurried footsteps. It was the kind of silence that pressed down on the chest, heavy and thick, like a warning no one could decipher. He tried to focus, but the girl's words looped endlessly in his mind. "They're here." Simple, yet haunting. He knew the look in her eyes when she said it. Fear, yes, but something more. Something he couldn't quite place. When he reached the double doors to the hospital's control room, he found 2 security officers standing guard. Their presence alone was strange. The hospital rarely needed such heavy security measures. The taller officer gave him a curt nod but said nothing, his hand resting uneasily on his radio. "Dr. Carter," the other officer greeted him quietly. "Director Miller is inside. She's been waiting for you." Without another word, Carter pushed open the door. Inside, the room hummed with low voices and the quiet crackle of security feeds. Screens lined the walls, displaying live footage of various hospital wings, parking areas, and corridors. A group of administrators stood in the corner, whispering anxiously, while a handful of medical staff gathered around Director Olivia Miller at the center of the room. Miller's sharp eyes lifted the moment Carter stepped inside. She was a woman who carried authority with ease, a presence commanding without effort. Tonight, however, her face was pale, and the usual calm in her expression was edged with unease. "Adrian," she said, motioning for him to come closer. "I need you to explain exactly what happened in room 204. He crossed the room to stand beside her, lowering his voice. The girl woke up. She asked for me specifically. When I arrived, she whispered something strange, just 2 words. Miller's gaze sharpened. What did she say? Carter hesitated, feeling the weight of the room's attention pressing in. She said, "They're here." And right after, the alarms triggered. The air seemed to shift. The hum of conversation around them faded, replaced by the quiet buzz of machinery. Miller's eyes flickered toward the screens. "Was there anyone else in the room with her?" she asked carefully. "Only the nurse," Carter replied. "No visitors, no family. As far as I know, she's been alone since she arrived." Miller exhaled slowly, crossing her arms. "I've seen lockdowns for a lot of reasons, Adrian. But this? A child whispering cryptic warnings before the entire hospital goes into high alert? It doesn't add up." "I agree," Carter said, glancing at the screens. "But I can't shake the feeling she knows something we don't. She's terrified, Olivia. There's something else going on here." Miller's lips pressed into a thin line. "I already called the police. They're sending someone over to do a full security sweep, but for now, no one leaves or enters the building." Carter glanced at the live feed of the hospital entrance. The front doors were sealed, red emergency lights flashing faintly above them. Patients in the waiting room sat uneasily, their eyes darting toward the security guards stationed by the entrance. "I want to talk to her again," Carter said after a moment. "See if she remembers anything else." Miller nodded. "Take someone with you. I don't want her left alone." As Carter turned to leave, the lights flickered again, plunging the room into brief shadow before snapping back to full brightness. The fluctuation was small, but it gnawed at his nerves. Stepping back into the hallway, he scanned the corridor, spotting a familiar figure near the nurse's station. "Nora," he called softly. The nurse from earlier looked up, her face visibly relieved to see him. She hurried over, her hands gripping the edges of her clipboard tightly. "Doctor, I'm glad you're here." "She's awake again." Carter's chest tightened. "Did she say anything else?" Nora shook her head. "No, but she's been staring at the window. She won't look away." Together, they moved quickly down the corridor, passing other patients' rooms. Some doors were cracked open, and a few patients peered out curiously, clearly sensing the unease that blanketed the hospital. When they reached room 204, Carter stepped inside quietly, letting the door drift shut behind him. The girl was sitting upright now, her small frame illuminated by the pale light from the window. Her eyes were locked on something outside, but when Carter followed her gaze, all he saw was the rain-drenched city streets stretching beneath the hospital. "Hey," Carter said gently, approaching the bed. "You're awake again." The girl slowly turned her head toward him. There was something distant in her expression, as though she was seeing through him rather than at him. "Do you remember what you said earlier?" Carter asked, his voice calm but probing. The girl's lips parted, but she didn't answer right away. Instead, her gaze flickered to the door behind him. "Is someone there?" she whispered. Carter's eyes narrowed slightly. He glanced over his shoulder, but the door was firmly shut. "No one's there," he reassured her. "Just me and Nurse Nora." The girl's breathing slowed, but her fingers twitched nervously at the blanket. "They don't like to be seen," she said softly. Carter exchanged a quick glance with Nora, who shifted uneasily by the bedside. "Who doesn't like to be seen?" Carter pressed carefully. For a moment, the girl didn't speak. She lowered her gaze to the blanket, her small hands tracing invisible patterns across the fabric. Then, just as Carter was about to ease off the questioning, she whispered two more words. "The Watchers." Carter felt the hair on his neck rise. Before he could respond, a sudden burst of static crackled from the intercom overhead. It lasted only a second, but left an eerie silence in its wake. Nora looked toward the ceiling, visibly unsettled. "The system's acting strange tonight," she muttered under her breath. Carter forced himself to focus. "I'll stay with her for a little while," he told Nora. "Can you check in with Director Miller? Let her know what the girl said." Nora nodded, clearly relieved to step out of the room. As the door closed, Carter sat down by the bed again, watching the girl carefully. "I'll stay here until you feel better," he said gently. The girl didn't reply. She simply stared out the window once more, her reflection barely visible in the glass. And as Carter followed her gaze, he couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere, out there in the rain, something, or someone, was watching right back. Carter sat by the girl's bed long after Nora left, the soft ticking of the clock marking the slow passage of time. Outside the window, the rain continued to fall, streaking the glass and distorting the faint glow of streetlights below. The girl hadn't spoken again, but she hadn't fallen asleep either. Her small figure seemed almost too still, as if she feared even the slightest movement would draw unwanted attention. Every so often, Carter found his eyes drifting toward the window too, scanning the darkness for something he couldn't name. Rationally, he knew there was nothing out there, just the city, the storm, and the usual late-night silence that settled over the hospital. But the weight of her words lingered, and with each passing minute, the sense of unease tightened like an invisible thread. The intercom crackled again. This time it was longer, the static sputtering for several seconds before cutting off abruptly. Carter glanced at the speaker mounted near the ceiling, frowning. Faulty wiring, maybe. That had to be it. Hospitals were full of quirks, old systems prone to ditches, lights flickering without reason. But tonight, those small inconveniences felt different, deliberate somehow. The girl shifted slightly under the blanket, drawing his attention back to her. Her fingers tugged at the edge of the fabric, clutching it like a lifeline. She wasn't trembling, but there was a tension in her shoulders that spoke louder than words. "Do you remember how you got here?" Carter asked softly, keeping his tone light. He didn't want to scare her, but the silence needed to be broken. She hesitated, eyes still fixed on the rain. "I remember running," she said quietly. "I was hiding before someone found me and brought me here." "Were you running from someone?" he pressed, leaning in slightly. The girl nodded, almost imperceptibly. "I think so, but I never saw them. I just felt them." Carter's grip on the chair's armrest tightened. There was something about the way she said it, detached yet absolute. He wanted to ask more, but before he could, a sharp knock echoed at the door. His heart jumped, the sound louder than it should have been in the quiet room. Carter stood and crossed to the door, cracking it open just enough to peer out. Nora stood in the hallway, her face pale. "Doctor, you need to come to the East Wing," she said, her voice low. "Something's happened." Carter glanced back at the girl. "Will you be all right for a few minutes?" She didn't respond at first, but then slowly nodded. "I'll be right back," he promised, stepping into the hallway and closing the door gently behind him. Nora's expression didn't change as she led him down the corridor, her footsteps brisk. "What's going on?" he asked, matching her pace. One of the nurses in pediatrics swears she saw someone in the hallway, but when security checked, there was no one there, Nora explained, glancing over her shoulder as if expecting someone to be following them. She said they were just standing there, watching her, but the cameras didn't pick up anything. Carter felt a cold shiver run down his spine. Maybe it was a patient, he suggested, though he didn't believe it himself. Nora shook her head. "That's what I thought. But the nurse was sure it wasn't. She said the figure looked wrong, like their face wasn't quite right. They reached the East Wing, where a small group of staff had gathered near the nurse's station. A security guard stood at the edge of the corridor, scanning the area with narrowed eyes. Miller was already there, her arms crossed tightly as she spoke to the nurse who had reported the sighting. The woman's hands trembled as she recounted what happened, her voice barely above a whisper. Carter caught snippets as he approached. He was tall, standing by the door to room 314. When I called out, he just faded. Faded. The word lingered uncomfortably. Miller turned as Carter approached. "Adrian, I was hoping you'd get here soon," she said, her tone clipped. "We're running out of explanations." Carter's gaze flickered to the nurse, who looked visibly shaken. "What room did you say you saw him by?" 314, she answered, wrapping her arms around herself. "I thought it was a patient at first, but I swear there was something wrong with his eyes. Like it weren't looking at me, but through me." Carter exchanged a brief glance with Miller before stepping past the group and moving toward room 314. The door stood slightly ajar, casting a thin slice of light across the otherwise dim corridor. Carter pushed it open, peering inside. The room was empty except for the soft hum of machines and an unoccupied bed. He exhaled slowly. "There's no one here," he called back. Miller appeared behind him, frowning deeply. "I don't like this," she admitted quietly. "Too many strange things happening at once." Carter nodded. "Me either." They returned to the nurse's station, where staff lingered in uneasy silence. One by one, they gradually dispersed, but the atmosphere remained heavy. "Keep an eye on the cameras," Miller instructed the guard as she prepared to leave. "If anything looks out of place, I want to know immediately." As Carter made his way back to room 204, his thoughts raced. The girl's words, the strange flickers on the intercom, the sighting near pediatrics, it all felt connected somehow, but by what he couldn't say. When he opened the door to room 204, the girl was exactly where he had left her, staring out the window. But this time, her hand was pressed against the glass, and the reflection staring back wasn't hers. Carter froze in the doorway, his heart thudding in his chest. For a split second, he thought his eyes were playing tricks on him. The reflection was faint, barely more than a shadowy outline, but it was unmistakably there, taller than the girl, standing just behind her as if watching over her shoulder. He stepped further into the room, forcing calm into his voice. "Hey, everything all right?" The girl didn't turn around. Her fingers gently traced the glass, as though she was trying to feel something just beyond its surface. "He's still out there," she whispered. Carter's eyes flickered to the window, but all he saw was the rain and the darkened street below. He approached carefully, kneeling beside her. "Who's out there?" She finally looked at him, and for the first time he noticed how pale she had become. Her wide eyes reflected more than just fear, they held recognition. "The man I ran from." The words hung heavily between them. Carter's mind raced, struggling to piece together what little information he had. Someone had been chasing her. That much was clear. But why would he come here, to a hospital crowded with people? And how could he possibly avoid the security cameras or the staff? He glanced at the window again, half expecting to see the figure standing there now, but the glass remained empty. "We're safe inside," Carter reassured her, though the words felt hollow. "No one can get in without us knowing." The girl didn't respond. Instead, she slipped back under the blanket, curling up against the pillow. Carter lingered for a moment before returning to his chair, but his thoughts remained unsettled. His gaze drifted to the intercom near the ceiling, waiting for another flicker of static. But the room stayed quiet, save for the rain tapping against the window. Hours passed, marked only by the soft rhythm of the clock and the occasional footsteps in the hall. Carter tried to convince himself it was just exhaustion playing tricks on his mind. The nurse's report, the reflection, it could all be explained. It had to be. Yet, as the night stretched on, the sense of being watched never fully faded. At some point, he dozed off in the chair, only to be jolted awake by the sound of the girl's voice. "Dr. Carter," she whispered, her tone urgent. He sat up quickly, rubbing his eyes. "What is it?" She sat upright in the bed, staring toward the window once more. This time, her hands gripped the edge of the blanket tightly. "He's inside now," she said softly. Carter's blood ran cold. His eyes darted to the door, but nothing seemed out of place. The hallway beyond remained dimly lit and empty. He forced a breath and stood, crossing to the door to check the lock. It clicked securely under his hand. No one came in, he told her, but even as he said it, Dot nodded at him. The girl's gaze never wavered from the far corner of the room. "Please," she said quietly. "Don't turn off the lights." Carter nodded, his pulse hammering. He returned to his chair, keeping his eyes on the same corner she watched. Nothing was there, but the air felt heavier, like they weren't alone. Time dragged slowly, each second stretching endlessly. The storm outside had begun to die down, but Carter found himself wishing the rain would stay. Somehow the noise had made the silence inside feel less threatening. Suddenly, footsteps echoed from the hallway. At first, they were faint, but they grew louder, approaching the room with an unhurried but deliberate pace. Carter rose slowly. The girl shrank further beneath the blanket, clutching it close. The footsteps stopped just outside the door. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Carter could feel the girl's eyes fixed on him, waiting for him to do something. With a quiet breath, he stepped closer to the door and peered through the small glass pane. The hallway was empty. His heart pounded, but he forced himself to open the door, stepping just outside. The corridor stretched silently in both directions. There was no sign of anyone, not even the lingering echo of footsteps. Carter ran a hand through his hair, exhaling shakily. But as he turned to go back inside, he noticed something small on the floor just outside the door. A single wet footprint. It was small, too small to belong to any adult. Carter knelt down, carefully running his finger over the faint outline. The water hadn't fully dried. He stood abruptly, glancing down the corridor once more. This time, he didn't wait to see if someone appeared. Carter shut the door and locked it behind him. Carter leaned against the door, his breath shallow as he stared at the faint footprint. The weight of the moment pressed down on him, and for the first time in years, he felt something unfamiliar, fear. He turned back to the girl, trying to mask it, but she was watching him carefully, as if she could see right through him. "Everything's fine," he said quietly, though his voice betrayed the tension in his chest. She didn't respond. Instead, her eyes drifted to the window once more. It was as if she sensed something he couldn't. Carter crossed the room, pulling the curtain shut. The rain had fully stopped now, leaving an eerie stillness outside. For a moment, he wondered if that was worse. Just as he let the curtain fall, the intercom crackled to life again. Carter froze. The static was louder this time, crackling with a distorted hum that dragged on longer than before. His eyes flicked to the girl, but she was already sitting up, her small hands clenched into fists. The static cut out abruptly, replaced by silence. Then, faintly, so faintly Carter wasn't sure he heard at first, came a voice. "She doesn't belong here." Carter's pulse spiked. He spun to the intercom, stepping closer as if that would somehow explain it away. The voice was distant, hollow, but unmistakably real. His hand hovered over the call button, ready to contact security, but he hesitated. The girl's voice stopped him. "Don't," she said softly. Carter turned to her. She wasn't afraid. Her face was calm, almost expectant, as if she had been waiting for this. "Who was that?" he asked, though part of him already knew the answer. She shook her head slowly. "It doesn't matter. He'll keep talking until I leave." Carter knelt beside her bed, lowering his voice. "No one's making you leave. You're safe here." Her gaze didn't waver. "That's not how it works." Before Carter could press further, a sudden knock rattled the door. It wasn't loud but sharp, 3 quick taps that echoed in the quiet room. Carter stood, his hand instinctively reaching for the handle. "Doctor." The girl's voice barely rose above a whisper. He paused, glancing at her over his shoulder. "Don't open it." The knocks came again. Carter's grip tightened around the handle, but he didn't turn it. His heart pounded in his ears, drowning out everything else. "Is there anyone else who knows you're here?" he asked. She shook her head. Carter stepped away from the door, his mind racing. He didn't hear anyone walk down the hall. Whoever, or whatever, was on the other side had appeared without a sound. The knocking stopped. Minutes passed, stretching longer than they should have. The hospital felt unnaturally quiet, as if the entire floor was holding its breath. Carter kept his eyes on the door waiting, but nothing happened. Eventually, he sank back into the chair near the bed, exhaling slowly. He glanced at the girl, who was watching him with a look of quiet understanding. "This has happened before, hasn't it?" he asked softly. She nodded. Carter leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "Who is he?" For the first time, her gaze dropped. "I don't know his name, but he follows you." Another nod. Carter pressed his lips together, trying to piece everything together. It didn't make sense. Hospitals were full of security cameras, locked doors, and staff constantly moving in and out. There was no way someone could follow her unnoticed. Unless... His thoughts trailed off as the lights flickered overhead. It was brief. barely more than a blink, but enough to make Carter's skin crawl. The girl shifted slightly in the bed, pulling the blanket up to her chin. Carter stood, his eyes scanning the room. Something felt different now. He couldn't explain it, but it was as if the room itself had changed. "Doctor," the girl said softly, her voice trembling for the first time. Carter turned to her, but she wasn't looking at him. Her eyes were fixed on the far corner of the room. And this time, Carter saw it too. A faint figure stood in the shadows, barely more than a silhouette. It didn't move, didn't speak. It simply watched. Carter's breath caught in his throat. He stepped in front of the girl, shielding her instinctively. The figure remained still, as if waiting. Carter reached for the intercom, pressing the call button with shaking fingers. "Security to room 306, he said quickly. "Now." The intercom crackled, but no response came. The figure took a single step forward. Carter didn't hesitate. He grabbed the girl's hand, pulling her from the bed. "Come on," he whispered urgently. She followed without question. The door swung open before he reached for it.